Right, we have Kanto Iwamura today. Let me briefly introduce Kanto today. Kanto was born in Tokyo, Japan, and studied architecture at the AA School in London, UK. Since his graduation at the AA, he has done various works, including graffiti and making, casting. He has developed his signature painting method known as a maze. He has developed his signature painting method, and as you can see, Kanto is architect and designer and also an artist. So we'll be able to peek into his works where he practices art or design within the discipline as an architect, which would be interesting very much. Kanto has a multicultural background and so as his practices worldwide. He works in Mexico City and Tokyo at the moment, and engaging with diverse concrete sculpture series. Let's hear more in depth of his world of abstract forms and primitive monumentalism. Welcome, Kanto.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kanto. So excuse me for the sort of glitchy conversation that I may start, because I haven't been really used to doing these sort of talks over Zoom. So let me get used to it as I speak. So forgive me for that. So just to add some, hello G. Just to add another aspect to what just Min-sung has talked about me. Well, she mentioned that I was doing murals and also architecture, but also sculptures. Well, so basically, well, first of all, when I've graduated the AA, I felt like I really wanted to travel the world and see what sort of practices there are. I never wanted to sort of embed myself into one practice and commit to it for the rest of my life. So I was traveling around the world, working in practices and seeing for myself what is most suited to me. And in the course of it, I went to Brazil, went to Mexico, Thailand, France, and all over the place, and worked as architect. But when I went back to Japan after sort of for a year of traveling around the world, I started a career as a commercial muralist, which happened by pure accident. I designed something for my friend, and that became very known and all over the media. And I started getting commissions by some people who wanted my art in their space. And as I was very much interested in the spaces and architecture primarily, I never really wanted to just paint a painting and just give it to them. So I just proposed something that I wanted to do, more like a mural in the room. And that went through. And so my life as a muralist started. And also, like, the mural was very interesting for me because the sort of methods of like integrating paintings and signages in the space was very sort of, well, like, there's something for me that was very interesting. And as I was always interested in graphics and graffiti and 2D art. But over the time, again, became interested in how to accommodate, well, to change the aspects of architecture in order to accommodate my art. So, or better yet, sort of making architecture the sole piece of art. This led me to start practicing as an architect again. And my first work is being built as we speak. The foundation of my building is just being built. But also I started working as a sculptor in order to experiment with variety of materials and forms, which at times supplements my own sort of careers, well, my professions, which are architecture and also painters. I didn't set out to be a person who wanted to sort of pursue 3 different professions at the same time. And it's pretty hard to sort of dwell with 3 different professions at the same time, especially when it's just by yourself. I wish there are like 2 more people who sort of specialize in that, because it will be so much easier to sort of bounce around ideas. But I still do enjoy the conversation of the influences my professions have to one to each other. And it's obviously a very hard task, but by accident, I was fortunate enough to have sort of similar people around me who are doing either architecture and art together, or some are chefs and they do architecture at the same time. So these sort of diverse professional, what I don't know what you call it, but sort of these multi-careers persons are like, they started to sort of exist around me. So I'm fortunate enough to have these people to sort of talk with, and the occasional conversation with them, and allows me to sort of maintain my composure as doing these like 3 careers at the same time. So what I'm going to talk about in these 2 lectures is about very much related to my experience and my influences, and also, well, it's very much about my own experience and my influences in towards art and architecture. So the first half, which is today, we will talk about sort of the influences to my experiments, and which are basically the sort of people from the 20th century who focused on bridging architecture or like industrial design with art, especially with abstract art. And I think I haven't mentioned the word indeterminacy yet, but I believe the sort of things that I'm going to talk about today is sort of very closely related to the theme of indeterminacy, and which I will talk about later. And the other lecture, which is in 2 weeks, I will talk about more of how to apply how I applied my influences in my, not really my practice. I'm going to talk about a school that I organized with my friends in Mexico, where we did abstract form finding through the use of concrete and wood, and which would be much more in detail and specific sort of closer look into how to build and how to sort of experiment with things. And today will be a little bit more about sort of what other people did which had similar mindset, like, well, with similar sort of ideology that I'm having right now. So allow me to start. Hopefully I can finish everything in 1 hour. Excuse me if anybody wants to have a question in between, please feel free. So first of all, I don't know if all of you have watched this new film. I just watched it a couple of weeks ago. It's the film called Tenet, directed by Christopher Nolan. And the film is, well, to me, was about entropy. Entropy is a measure of molecular disorder or randomness of a system, which at times goes back in time. It's the molecular, it's in that sort of microscopic world, the molecules can go back in time or they can disappear. And then it's this sort of randomness and the disorder, which I think Christopher Nolan sort of added characters to and made a film about. And this film was like very much to me about a form of uncertainty. And in other words, uncertainty can be described as indeterminacy. But anyways, I'm not going to go in too much about the movie, but the film ends without a definite answer, but more of a question. And I always like a film when it just leaves me a big blank space to sort of fill in my own understanding into it, and then to sort of talk about it with other people. So to say, a construction of my own take of the work. And I think that is also a consequence of an intentional indeterminacy. So, in a way, the indeterminacy, or like the openness, leads me to think more, and also to start like having emotions and also creating conversations. And I think it can be also said, called as sort of speculative, or well, it can be also called like a speculative film. But I think the phrase indeterminacy very much fits for me in these types of movie. And the questions, the potential, the potentials of the questions lead solutions that go beyond the conditions of the questions. Well, that's what I mean. But by that, I mean, so the questions can lead to answers which is beyond the conditions of the question. And what I'm going to talk about now is about sort of the artists who dwelled with the idea of indeterminacy, so to say, or better yet, to sort of create questions rather than a final product. And for me, the beginning of this idea of making question as art was sort of in the time, in the Russian avant-garde time, where futurism, well, not futurism, but the suprematism and constructivism started. And the first person that I want to introduce would be Kazimir Malevich. So he was a very sort of realist painter before the Russian Revolution, but when the Russian Revolution happened, he started sort of creating and experimenting with the art of geometrical shapes, flatly painted on space. And he says he liberated art from the cluster of representational word. So he freed colors and form from their descriptive function, so it's no longer a cat or a dog or landscape, but he purely experimented with forms and colors. And this was regarded as non-objective art. But in other words, I again reiterate that I think this is very much like an indeterminacy-based art, a form of art, which wishes viewers to think and feel, and those emotions that arise from it is the pure art that this guy has intended. But I was also very much interested because his forms and sort of way he developed his paintings were very much almost like a diagrammatic part of when you think about architecture, or even sort of tools or everyday objects. And this, well, sort of these three images are sort of like the sort of expanse of his work. And he says the keys, well, no, don't worry about that, actually. I'm just going to go on. I've been too long dwelling with this. And furthermore, he was very good. Well, he was very good with the spatial understandings of things. And so in his architectonics, he went so far to experiment with three-dimensional forms, which were directly informed by his sort of black square paintings. And it is known that these three models contributed largely to the architecture of the 20th century. In tradition, there has always been a strong linkage between painters and architects, but in the 20th century, as modernism generated very much more like the sleek and sort of very conceptual shapes, the relationship became more profound. And one of his students called this suprematism, well, it's the movement of art, the art movement. He called it a halfway station between painting and architecture. So it was neither art or neither architecture, but it was somewhere in between, or something, a very new frontier, which was, I bet it was very exciting to be at that time, to be in Russia at that time, or in Europe. And this didn't just stop there, it further developed further into a form of constructivism, which I think for me, one of the most influential person in like constructivism was Vladimir Tatlin. He was sort of, he wanted to break further from a conventional painting. He thought art should have a relationship with the surrounding space. So in this art collection he calls Counter Reliefs, his desire was to abandon the traditional sort of rectangular painting plane. And also he started using materials instead of like paint, like wood, metal, glass, to sort of form shapes on top of a board. And this behavior of like constructing something became sort of known as the phrase for constructivism. This was his earlier work, and then he went further. He was no longer interested in the wall, as to say, as a background, but he wanted to turn the wall into some kind of attribute to his artwork. So in this case, he wanted to sort of leave the two-dimensional wall. So he used the corner of the wall to form his new piece of art. And how to call it? He called it elaboratory models for the solution of utilitarian tasks, which means he wanted to sort of create a new form of art. And in the new form of art, he was trying to research into material and volume and construction, and sort of finding new possibilities of what materials can do, more than just what they're used for. And further on, he went into a more of an architectural endeavor. And this is one of the most famous pieces built by Tatlin. It was actually intended to be a functioning building, although it ended up being not realized. But he wanted to sort of combine purely artistic forms with sort of more use further on. At the beginning, it was very, very much of like an experiment of combination and sort of what you call it. He wanted to sort of explore forms and shapes, but further on he got to the point where he wanted to start adding sort of uses and functions to his artistic forms. And for me, this was the very beginning of how in the 20th century, how art started becoming related to architecture, like the spatial understanding of things. Later on in the constructivism, artists became a little bit more graphically evident in the relation of architecture, but things started flying. In later days, Buckminster Fuller, he was also very much interested in making things fly. But you kind of understand the trajectory of this Russian avant-garde from a black square painting into real existing subjects, which people can inhabit, but it is in the sky. So everything was very utopian, but also very challenging with what was possible at that time. And there was constant questions being asked, what is possible? And then and people just try to come out with more possibilities. And there comes Bauhaus. So a number of artist groups, movements evolved around the formation of these many schools after the Russian movement, which taught the integration of art, architecture, and design. And the most famous one was, probably all of you know, is Bauhaus. It's founded in Weimar in Germany by Walter Gropius. one of the most famous buildings, well, maybe not the most famous, but is the series of interlocking geometric forms around the central matrix. And it was somehow sort of expression of how abstract art and these like sort of flat composition and a functioning, well, like utilitarian aspects can be combined into a three-dimensional form as well, more like a working architecture. And well, at this time, the celebration of industrial materials and techniques led to the banishing of ornaments and the small tactile things and handcrafted elements in favor of a sleek, machine-like aesthetic. So this, I'm not going to go further into this, but what I wanted to sort of introduce you to is this one artist who I very much like, is a German artist called Erwin Knipp. And he's also a contemporary of the Bauhaus. He lived and explored further on. I guess he passed away in the 90s, but he has many works to be seen in Germany. I very much recommend for you to go see one of his work, which I'm going to briefly show you. So he's a German artist, and he thought metaphysical aspects in art. In other words, examining the sort of potential and the actuality. So like if there's one thing, a very solid cube, he would sort of place it in a strange way or move it or accumulate and sort of try with very simple geometric shapes, but he sort of always had in his mind was, what happens if there's a person in this space, or what happens is some kind of paperweight on your table. And there was always in his head, there was always a play of scale, and also what I call the play of positive and negative, which is the positive will be the sort of evident, the actual shape, and the negative is what could be inside or what could be around it. And he was also like, he was very much influenced by Bauhaus, and he was very interested in combining architecture, design, and art together. And it can be sort of, I don't know how evident it is in this painting, but the potential for, he always seeked for the potential for another medium. So his paintings, well, his drawings were very dry, but always hinted what it can turn into. So it was very, well, it didn't hint, it was very open to what it can turn into. So I don't know what you could think through this painting, but for me, it may look like a cassette tape, more like an industrial sort of design object, or maybe like a binocular, or maybe a house. So the scale was very free, and I can understand that he always thought architecturally and like in an artistic, creative sense about the interior and exterior of his creation. And this is a place which in the 80s he realized, it's a place called Insel Hombroich near Stuttgart in Germany, and where Erich created a series of what he calls accessible sculptures. In other words, it's an architectural sculpture. And he made about 20 of these buildings in a very big site and with a very beautiful environment with green and rivers, and this whole park was almost like an exhibition of his sculptural pieces, but only it was accessible. So you can go inside the sculptures and feel the space and feel sort of ask yourself what these spaces are for. Most of the houses are being used as galleries, but at the same time, in some of them, there's nothing inside. And you just go in and you just have to kind of ask yourself what it is. Nobody is there to tell you what it is. And this is the interior of it. The lighting is very interesting, and the color white is something which I think he used because he never wanted to specify what it is. As soon as he uses bricks or steel or wood, it becomes a representation of some sort of past work, and the white color or the white texture leaves people to kind of think beyond what is in front of your eyes. He also made a few unenclosed accessible sculptures. So in this one, there was a roof. For this one, there is not a roof. So it's purely just something you pass through or contemplate inside. But then there is also smaller scale sculptures, which just stays and as almost like a landmark in the environment. But also then there's like a smaller scale, which to me, it looked like a maquette or model for one of his bigger pieces. But then again, it also looks very finished and beautiful. And then there's also all these small models where I thought, okay, breaking free from the restriction scale is very interesting. Like to me, like the entire, I don't know, like, is it called a matryoshka, the Russian doll? Like, you know, you open it and it's always the same thing, but it's just in a different scale. So like this whole park is an art installation, and wherever you look is an art installation. And it was very interesting. It was like a trip for me. And for me, I was very much intrigued by the way how he used scale and never regarded scale as some kind of abstraction. It didn't really matter if it was a building for him or if it was a sculpture. He just liked the question, or like this indeterminacy of the objects, because those things are the exact thing that asks that question to people. And the people, I think he really liked watching people by like being left in this non-answer situation where the people can always sort of think of more, or like come up with further adaptation of his work. I don't know if you're familiar with Maria Montessori. She's an Italian physician and an educator who, there's a lot of schools around for children. And why I'm showing you this picture is because I thought there's a certain relation between what she did with her education toys and what Erwin did with his art. And in this case, these toys are called the didactic materials, based on, so basically these toys are for children as to understand order and concept of abstract. She wrote, our sensational material, in fact, analyzes and represents the attributes of things, dimensions, forms, colors, smoothness or roughness of surface, weight, temperature, flavor, noise, and sounds. It is the quality of the object, not the object themselves, which are important. So she thought it's a very important thing for kids to learn, that with their senses rather than with their eyes. So what she meant with these toys was that the kids move their body and feel the objects, and through that they start to understand what, like, how abstract things can exist, and how, so by piling up these things, or like by placing them on order, they can understand a certain type of order in this society. And for me, there is something very interesting, and there's a certain relation between this and the earlier work that I just showed. So going next, this is another very, I don't know if he's obscure enough. He's very famous in Mexico or in Latin America. He's a German sculptor. And he's also He's from around the mid 20th century, and he was a very close ally of Louis Barragan. I don't know if you know him, but Louis Barragan is also a very famous Mexican architect. And together they worked very closely, one being the artist and one being the architect. They worked together on very numerous public projects. And they both had this idea that modernism has lost its contact with its community. In other words, that there's too much emphasis on the functions of the building, but not so much in the emotions or like the sort of sentimental part of architecture. And this is one of very famous work from Louis Barragan. It's from his own house. And Louis Barragan is known for bringing back artistic qualities to architecture by bringing back, well, by using the color, the light, and the abstract arrangement of architectural components. He almost made his architecture into a form of art. And he already by himself was very strong in terms of expressions. But together with Matthias, they came up with this quote: "Only when architecture afford real emotion can man again consider an art." So for them, they wanted to sort of bring architecture back into a certain form of art. And Matthias and him, they built these satellite towers in 1957 as a landmark for this new bed town in Mexico City. In Mexico City, the sort of art, a famous form of art was always mural, until these two guys came in and started building sort of these public sculptural architectures. And this is a very brief, well, there's so much more to them, but I'm just going to stop from introducing you to him, about him more. But I wanted to sort of show in the methods of how he came up with these shapes and how he was playing with different materials and medias in order to come up with these ideas. So for instance, these are some photo exercises that he did in the Alps of Italy. So he took a photo, and the contrast of the background and the foreground, he realized there's some kind of sculptural aspect in these pictures. If you're just in the place, I guess there's something hard. It's not that easy to realize, but as soon as he took a photo, which I think is one method of exploring, he realized that there's some kind of contrast, that it has a very strong sculptural painting over them. And at some point he realized there's some kind of emotional feeling to it when things start to form a circle. And in this case, it wasn't necessarily forming a circle, but these sort of accumulation of objects and being very close to each other started creating a certain form of feeling. And for him, that was something very interesting, and went on to experiment with smaller models, but also with perspective drawings, sort of showing what it would look like if these things are humongous and you look upwards. So there's all these ways of speculation that he did. He also used sort of in the more of a formal language, sort of in order to find the shape of these sculptures, he used paper. And he also, what he was very good at was he documented his processes very well. So even this piece is, although it's a process of in an exploration, he can call it a form of art. So I think there's something to learn from, more like just about archiving as well. And like never think about never sort of discard a process, and always find a way to archive it or frame it so that you can reference back, or people can reference it to certain things later on. And these are the outcomes for one of his sculpture towers. It wasn't just this. He was also later hired to build, introduce public sculptures in Mexico City in celebration for the Mexico Olympics. And I wanted to briefly talk about this, which is called a concrete poetry, a form of poetry which has actually a very strong relation to the constructivist movements, which I talked before. It's a liberation of words. It's a form of liberation where like words are liberated from their actual conventional meanings and result in a kind of abstract sound visual poetry. So the letters become more of the centerpiece rather than the phrases or the sentences. And this is also something that Matthias Goeritz like practiced, because this was a form of art that can travel much faster around the world. He used the media very well, and he realized some form of poetry is also a kind of, well, just in order to sort of make himself famous around the world, he used paper media to sort of communicate with people. And then in one of the methods he used is concrete poetry. Going back to his sculpture work, this is one of his sculptures from the Mexico '68 Olympics. But he also invited artists from around the world to commemorate the Olympics. And each artist had like actually about 30 artists from around the globe representing their countries started building their sculptures. It's, in one word, it can be described as a commemoration of the Olympics, but the artists had a big site, and they were also, they had to come up with certain answers for the site. And a lot of them somehow form a space where people can conversate underneath, or maybe you can sit on the inclines, or maybe they're more sheer sort of formal expressions, or maybe in some of them you can even go inside. So, which is actually the sort of turning point in Matthias Goeritz's works, which I find where the abstract and the programmatic, the utilitarian or the use of it sort of start morphing together. This is one of his work for the UNAM University in Mexico City. UNAM University is a humongous university, and they have a humongous site, and they locate in the southern part of Mexico City, where it's very close to the volcanic mountain, and an entire site was covered in volcano one time. Not when the university was there, but before. But over the time, the volcano, well, the lava of the volcano was covered in forestry, but there was something about the landscape that Matthias Goeritz saw, and he wanted to excavate and reveal a certain history of the site by enclosing it within a circle, and then creating a certain meditative, or a space where people can just, do whatever they want to do. So there's not a specific program, but not a specific program is also a program. So like leaving this use of space up to the users is also a type of a program, I believe. And this is the sort of view that when you're inside, all these inclines of these concrete abstract objects are perfect for people to sit or to sort of recline on. So for me, it's almost intended for people to rest and to gaze into the forestry and into the sort of lava of the land, to see the history and meditate. So for me, it's almost like a meditation space enclosed by a huge set of abstract objects. So that was very interesting for me.
Is there a name or a title of this project?
This title, I am sorry, I actually don't know, but this
How
is
do I
a
Google it?
sculpture in Unam University,
How do
UNAM.
UNAM, Unam
Yeah,
University.
and
Thank
it's actually the university has way more of these external installations. So it's like a huge park with these incisions, and students go there, have parties. But it used to be open to the public. Now I think it's a little bit restricted because there was a fire. But I don't know. There are ways to get into it. But basically, it is a very interesting space.
It's
It's
really
like
interesting.
beyond the use,
Mm.
or like the sort of conventional way of doing architecture.
Yeah, it's a
I don't
very
know why this is not famous enough.
oh, yeah. I was looking at it and saying, wow, I've never seen this thing before.
Yeah, it's like it's also very carefully located in the landscape, so you don't really see any type of civilization around it. So you're there in so sort of calmness. And I will talk about my Mexico workshop next in 2 weeks' time, but this is one of our like sort of key moments where this is a photo where we took our students to this place, and we were there for about 2 to 3 hours. Just being there was enough of a reason to be there for 2 hours. So further on, I'm going to talk about Isamu Noguchi. This, I think, is a little bit less of an infamous person. I think many of you know him, especially now he started regaining a lot of his fame in the recent years. And why I'm interested in him, why I'm interested in him is because of his ways of using materials and how he was able to form the shapes out of materials freely. He was very good at using tools, and I think he worked tirelessly. He was always working. So I think there's sort of the constant production of some forms and is just never being tired of it. I think there's something very fascinating about him, and I'm going to briefly talk about what he has done and how he may inform the idea of indeterminacy. So he went to Paris in younger days to learn under this sculptor called Brancusi, who is also a very famous artist in Paris and became again very famous in the last few years. And there he learned the care for tools, a love of materials, and strong work habits. But he was self-taught. He never went to a school of sculpture. He never learned architecture. He never went to a design school. He always had the right people around him. He was gifted enough to sort of have all these mentors to watch and to learn from, or by helping. He learned a lot from them, but his methods were very instinctive. When it comes to thinking about shapes, he was very free in terms of scale. And again, I think there's a relation in the constructivist movements of like how these black shapes are created, but only a little bit more organic, because he was very much in love with the nature, and he believed that the nature is a sort of the source of art. But also I found it very interesting is how he dwelled with human scale playground components. So he wasn't really interested in building buildings. He was interested in sort of proposing a landscape where kids can play or adults can play. So there's like a notion of sort of playing and movement, having fun and having a movement on his sculpture pieces. And this is one of his development of his piece called the Black Mantra, which one piece lies in America and one piece lies in Sapporo in Japan. But also he was, in here you can see this sort of exploration in terms of materiality and how to feasibly stack. So he was very much, although he didn't really go to schools, he was very smart to understand how things can work and its physics. And he also was very interested in this sort of these tactile forms and sort of playing tools, more like using metals. And he was very like able to use different materials like stone, wood, metal, and the sort of understanding of it in his later days allowed him to actually realize all these projects. Actually, he's very known for not realizing a lot of his projects, but because he worked so hard to produce a lot, like so many art objects, he actually, I think in my opinion, he is definitely one of the most influential sculptors when it comes to creating public spaces, and how he has, and this achievement that he has in terms of architectural and design world is humongous. And I think it's quite unheard of from an artist. This is, in later days, he created this table sculpture format. It's called a table sculpture format. It's these playground, ideas of a playground in these table-like shapes, and where he experimented with different shapes and how these shapes can sort of communicate with people and how children can play. And this is one of many of his projects. It was never built, but this one, for instance, was built. But what I'm very interested in was this sort of way he was thinking in terms of landscape. Rather than creating symbol objects and calling it art, he almost somehow had a notion of a landscape or the world or something beyond on his art pieces. This was called Arizona, and this is when he went to some kind of camp in Arizona. He was asked to come up with a proposal of what to do with the desert. And this is also another piece of proposal. Well, some may call proposal, or some may call a piece of art. And I think it's that kind of ambiguity between these two ideas that I think that where the work really becomes interesting. And for him, he says, when I refer to it as land sculpture, this is what I mean: water flow, nature's passage. So there's the reason for his organic shape is always constantly influenced by the nature. And he says works of this kind are distilling of possibilities within a frame of limits. So his work of art did did show a type of a limit or a frame, because it was a finite shape. But he wanted to enclose as many possibilities in it. So in this case, you can see mountains, or maybe it's a chair. He never wanted to call it a table, but it's that kind of ambiguity of the object, which I find it very interesting in terms of architecture and also in terms of design and art. And this is actually quite funny. He made a sculpture to be seen from Mars. And then it's like his sort of endeavor in finding possibilities just went outside the world. Actually, not just outside the world, but he started trying to communicate with the future and the place which human might reach in, I don't know, 100 years' time. So there's something quite timeless about what he was doing. And I very much like that idea of timelessness and this sort of broad subject of opening up some possibilities. So I'm kind of getting close to the end of my lecture, and I just wanted to sort of close it with this phrase: you don't need to invent anything, you just need to see it differently. Well, this is something that you should ask yourself, but also ask somebody who sees your work. I think there's always another possibility in what can be reached from one object or an idea. And in this way, I think you can open yourself up to more new ways of design, or like something that you never really were interested in before. Maybe it can open up to you all of a sudden, and thus I think is a very sort of interesting, or not interesting, but I think it's a very useful way to a useful method to find shapes and forms. Well, this is just a teaser what I'm going to talk about next, or like in 2 weeks. It's about what we do in Mexico City. In Mexico. It's about concrete and formwork, and I'm going to talk about the positive and the negative, which in this case, the left is the formwork of the concrete piece on the right. And to me, I think there's something quite beautiful about these two things, is that I can't really tell what I want to be the last piece, or what I want to show it to the world. But the formwork is always some sacrificial part. You cast something and then you throw it away. So it's always something that you never see in the world. So therefore, I think it's a very interesting thing. And the concrete is very sort of static and it stays there. So, but the concrete is also an informant of what the formwork might be like. And it's this kind of conversation between the positive and negative, which opens up to a whole new spectrum of form finding. Well, this will be it for today. And thank you for listening.
I'm really, really looking forward to next 2 weeks after your lecture. I mean, what's the material of the formwork? Is that plywood?
This is just stacked plywood.
Right. Did you CNC cut it?
Yes, I did. The CNC. This was actually from a project. This is actually not what we did in the school. This is a very recent project that I did for a hotel. And it's actually the hotel, well, the client wanted me to create a few sculptures in their garden, but also which has a function as mosquito repellent in case.
Can I have that one as well? How are you going to make that mosquito repellent?
I'll show it to you next week.
Okay, yeah.
No more images.
Continue in 2 weeks. Great. Yeah. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Really looking forward to your next second lecture. Well,
I hope it made enough sense. I tend to
totally
drift off.
Very informative. Really good references and nice namings that you gave to us so that we can search them.
Okay.
Brilliant. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.